Well, that essay, I think, came out of my attempt to show that even though we normally talk about pandemics as a moment potentially where different countries and different centers of power would come together and work together, the diplomats that are joining this talk know very well that when they prepare these statements about how two countries can work together in the future, pandemics is always there. And those statements between America and China, if you're looking for something where there could be cooperation, and over the past few years I've worked on those kind of documents, you would always struggle to find areas where America and China could work together, and pandemics was always there, and every diplomat would volunteer that suggestion. That always seemed to me rather facile, and I think events proved that, in fact, the coronavirus pandemic became a background for geopolitical competition. That seemed obvious to me at the very beginning when I published the article, and I think it's been confirmed by events. Every day it becomes more and more of that, and it's now so accepted that The Economist, the latest edition, is China winning the coronavirus war, or the coronavirus competition, to which the Chinese authorities, the foreign ministry, responded with some anger and disappointment that the virus should not be a matter for competition, while in fact those very Chinese authorities behave daily as if it is a battleground. It's very obvious to me that it has become a battleground. And I think it also points towards what could happen in the future with climate change, where I see the same dynamics could also apply. And the discussion we've been having for 10, 20 years of climate change as an opportunity for humanity to come together may turn out to be slightly unrealistic. Now, on the question of East and West, I happen to be traveling in Asia throughout the whole of February. It's in Pakistan, India, Nepal, Singapore, Philippines, and Vietnam. And, throughout these travels, all throughout February, the virus was everywhere. It became almost a constant presence in my life and very oppressive already in February. And at the same time, I was reading news from Europe and the US. In Europe, there were intense discussions, which you must have followed as an MEP, about the MFF, this old obsession of Brussels bureaucrats, and emergency meetings, I think, in the middle of February, if not in the second half of February. And in the US, still the question of impeachment. So it called to mind this real contrast between a part of the world that was dealing with reality and with events, and a part of the world that was really living in a very complacent bubble. And I think that posed a certain question that I've been very interested in for a long time, that my first book was about, of, on the one hand, how Asia and Europe are more and more integrated, but also how, in a way, Europe in particular has lost some of the characteristics that made it such a vibrant civilization. And one of them, of course, is this concern with the future, this attentiveness to change, which now I think is more powerful in Asia, and not only in China, but all over Asia. There was a sense of what one could call moral realism, of a certain acute understanding of the human condition, if you want to put it that way. That the world continues to be, nature continues to be a hostile place, that one has to live in the world as if all this framework of comfort and stability can collapse. This has been a lesson taught by history, by philosophy, by religion, and that we have lost in Europe in particular. So there was a certain moral realism that every day traveling these countries I could see. That people would be aware of the world they live in, and they would be aware of, in a way, of the human condition in a deeper sense. But also the question of technology, that in many of these countries, in some of them fewer resources that you have in Europe, people were trying to use technology to fight the virus. This was very clear in Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan. But even Vietnam was already researching very early in February, if not January, the most effective treatments. And it's true, even though one perhaps cannot entirely trust the numbers. I think Vietnam hasn't had a single death, but it's certainly true. They have a good number of patients. It's certainly true, even if we don't entirely trust the numbers, that Vietnam has done a good work on the treatment side of things. So Singapore was a good example of using digital technology, and Vietnam is a good example of reorganizing the hospitals and finding the most effective treatments and testing those quickly. So I came out of that experience with sort of a cuter realization that this would be a moment of geopolitical competition and that the West was not prepared. And I think what's happened in the meantime confirms this. We have come out of it with a sense that deep changes are necessary in Europe and the United States, that they are both much more fragile than they thought. And I'm reminded of discussions I had over the past 2 years where I tried to make this point that I make in my book, that in particular Europe in some ways, but also the US in different ways, have become too complacent and too comfortable in their own position, and that they should be prepared for a crisis that was coming. And I think it has arrived. Now, the question I think you want me to turn to that is what will happen in Europe and the US. It is a question whether Europe and the US will be able to actually use this crisis to change these factors that I'm talking about and to reform deeply, to find actually a new way to look at the world, because I think the crisis is that deep. Or whether this decline will accelerate. And the answers might be slightly different for Europe and for the United States. But it is, I think, brings to the surface and to consciousness a number of changes that were happening and forces people in Europe and the United States to actually face a world that now looks very different. It was very obvious to me, thinking back to those times in February, that people, I think this applies to Europe and the United States equally. They were not thinking about the possibility of a pandemic at all because they thought that this only happens in other parts of the world, essentially in the developing world. There was a classical case of fall, of collapse being preceded by pride. It was very obvious on January 23rd, China closed down completely one of its major cities, 12 million people, and a city that is thriving, cosmopolitan, entirely modernized city. I was there 10 years ago, and then I returned a year ago, and an extraordinary city, in fact, an example of the new Chinese city, more efficient, more well-organized than Beijing. And if this happens in a city like Wuhan, the obvious conclusion that one should have taken in Europe to begin with was that one had to get prepared. And that was the conclusion that people took in places like Philippines or Vietnam or Singapore. In fact, in places like Philippines and Vietnam, the conclusion was, if China is suffering so much from this, then what will happen to us? We are less prepared than China. Well, in Europe, the conclusion was the opposite. This happens in China because China is China. It's an authoritarian country. It's still a chaotic country, undeveloped, with poor technology. They can only copy. People have this image of China as being, a place of filthy markets and filthy, chaotic hospitals. And they thought, of course, this could happen in China, but it could never happen here. There is a moral parable here that I think one has to be hard-edged enough to think about it, to consider. It is, I think, the first story coming out of the pandemic is a story of Western pride. I remember thinking in February, looking at the complacency in Europe, well, perhaps this complacency is justified because, after all, we do have these health systems with primary care that we consider the best in the world, and they should be able to respond. Universal health care, but what turned out to be the case is that universal health care, if the hospitals are breaking point, doesn't help you. Doesn't matter if it's free, if simply there are not enough ventilators. So I wouldn't be surprised that Europe would react by reinforcing its belief and commitment to the welfare state, to public health care, that more money would be invested in public health in the next few years, that perhaps one would be tempted to go back to those decades where the state had a heavier role in the economy in Europe. I think there'll be calls for a universal basic income in Europe. And it would be rather easy to come out of the crisis with a system of that kind being in place, because it will be used temporarily for a few months. Now, the question, of course, in Europe is there will be a tendency to do this, but the conditions are not very propitious because many countries don't have the financial wiggle room to actually do this. It's possible that one would go back to older ideas from the 70s and to the old classical European social democracy. The problem with this is, and it's obvious that there are no good options, this will be very tempting, but in many countries it can only be done if there are mechanisms of financing at the European level. But there isn't really the political will and appetite for this in many other parts of Europe. So on the one hand, there will be enormous pressure in many countries to increase public spending, to concentrate more economic power in the state. But this will also put enormous pressure on the EU as a whole. And so we are caught between different forms of pressure and political pressure, which makes it very difficult for Europe to react. We'll see what the decision is in the European Council, but the way the debate is being framed reminds me of 2011, but of course with much higher stakes, both because it's the second time around and because the crisis is much deeper. I think there's reason to be concerned about the EU in particular and how it will be able to resist this enormous strain on its structures that is going to happen. Now, the United States, I think, again, will reinforce some of its natural tendencies. I see already happening a re-examination of what might have gone wrong. That reminds me to some extent of what happened after September 11th. There is an ongoing movement about how the United States had become too complacent, both in its relations with China, but also in its relation to technology. There is a growing movement in Silicon Valley about dismantling the regulatory and political obstacles to technological innovation and associating the coronavirus crisis with technological stagnation. So I wouldn't be surprised in the case of the United States that in fact, after a period of turmoil, the country will be able to withdraw some lessons that are important about the need to speed up technological innovation. Technology in the United States had become too consumer focused and too software focused. Silicon Valley, there's no one interested in hardware anymore. Everyone is interested in software. Everyone's interested in consumer experience. Of course, you know, this was the people that over the past 10 or 15 years gave us Instagram, but weren't really able to change the transportation system, the way cities are organized, the way hospitals are organized, telemedicine. It was an enormous failure. Everywhere where technology actually impacts daily life, China, talk about this in my first book, has been much superior. In China, you see technology in daily life. In the United States, you know that it's there, hidden in some exciting lab in Silicon Valley, but not being used in daily life to actually change the physical world and to change everyone's life. So I think it's possible that there will be now an appetite and an impulse to do this in America. This is the positive side. The negative side is increased polarization, which was already a breaking point and now increasing even more. Complete lack of political trust, Americans more and more don't trust any ideas that come from public authorities. Conspiracies are growing, and that, of course, is a matter of concern. Let me put it this way. I think European societies are better prepared to continue on the path that they are now, sacrificing the economy in a responsible way. The United States, you'll see a response against this that's already happening. But it's not clear at the end of the day what is the better path, because I think what we also see in the United States is a profound rebellion against the causes that gave rise to the crisis. And I don't see that enough in Europe. Europe is now gone into a certain register of adaptation, but not to look deeply into the causes of the crisis. Final thought on I've already talked about that, but on Germany. Let me say it's still about the United States. My book about the United States is about escapism. It's about America as a great experiment of fleeing from reality and creating an imaginary world. I think we've seen that a lot in the coronavirus crisis. I see three phases that the United States may be going through. First, all throughout February, there was a moment of simply ignoring or evading the coronavirus crisis. It was even more vivid in the US than in Europe. I think both Europe and the US were ignoring the crisis as it developed. But in the US, as it always happened, it was given extra drama by many people, by Fox News, by others, by Donald Trump, calling it the flu. Obviously, a European politician, even if he thought it was the flu, would be a bit more careful in his or her public statements. Then there's a second phase that we're going through now of dramatization, where one deals with the crisis, but not in a scientific focused way, but in a highly politicized and dramatic way. Every day there's some development that is not directly related to the public health crisis, but that transforms it into some extraordinary plot. There seems to be the need for this. You know, a week ago, it was the idea that Donald Trump may be benefiting from stocks that he holds in some pharma companies. Yesterday, there was a suggestion that perhaps some Democratic senators may be Chinese agents. 2 days ago, Trump suggested that perhaps China deliberately spread the virus. So there's an element of high drama added to the very serious crisis. And then I think we may enter a third phase where this escapism takes a technological form, where the United States tries to create a system that protects it against pandemics and other similar crises in the same way that it created a system of surveillance that protects it against terrorism. So I see this dynamic of escapism playing itself out in America. Europe, well, there were many things that could be discussed about Europe's reaction. There has been an extraordinary fixation on the question of Euro bonds, and I'm interested in hearing your opinion about this. I think it's an important question to know how the countries that are more deeply affected will respond to it. Eurobonds is not the only possible response. I don't even think it's the main one. The main one is total clarity from the ECB about the fact that it will support these countries. The lesson I learned while I was in government, and don't have a problem admitting that when I came out of government in 2015, my opinions were slightly different from when I arrived. Working the prime minister in 2011, it became obvious to me that the ECB could do more than I thought at first, and that it could have a greater impact than I thought at first. But that for me was the lesson of the Eurozone crisis, that in the end, it is about the ECB. So I was much more worried when those ambiguous statements came from the ECB about a month ago than I am about the Eurobonds. They were corrected, of course, by Christine Lagarde, but that was much more worrisome than this debate about Eurobonds. I'm slightly puzzled. It seems that we are trying to fight those old battles again. from 2011 that the people who think they lost now see an opportunity to reopen the fight. I don't think that's the best way to deal with it. And then, of course, I think there were other elements that are being completely forgotten, that perhaps Europe has to reformulate its relation with technology. That's happening now. And there's a story today in Politico that I haven't read yet about an intense debate going on about the new tracing app. And we'll see whether Europe will go back to the drawing board, the EU will go back to the drawing board and see whether these questions about digital technology and privacy need to be at least rethought in some way without abandoning privacy or privacy as a value. There were, to me, questions that seemed more urgent. I'm still frustrated and angry that Europe was not able to react in a way that would alleviate the crisis in Italy and Spain by essentially mobilizing resources across the whole EU. After it is so obvious that China was able to use national resources to fight the epidemic in Wuhan, doctors were moved en masse. I don't remember the number, but tens of thousands of doctors came all over China to Wuhan and Hubei. And in the United States, the same thing, where we see every day that resources are being moved around to face the crisis where it is more acute. Now, Europe is completely unable to do this. Germany did receive 200 patients from outside Germany, which is not an extraordinary number. And I think it's actually something that is happening a little bit all over the world. I mean, Singapore probably has received a good number of patients from Malaysia, one way or another, and in other parts of the world. I mean, if the European project is about this, then it's being replicated in many parts of the world. It should be about much more. It should be about actually trying to approximate what was done in China and the US, where resources would be moved quickly to Italy, ventilators and doctors. And then when I talk about these, people tell me doctors cannot be moved to Germany because they're in critical condition. Well, that was not the idea. The idea would be that doctors and ventilators would be moved to Italy. And then when Germany needed them, they would be moved back. Germany and other countries that were not so affected at the time would keep a strategic reserve. All this could have been done in the council through an ad hoc mechanism that was done for the refugee crisis, for example. No consideration of this. And then I was discussing with an economist journalist this the other day, and he said, well, what are you talking about, Bruno? It's really very tricky. People don't want to dispense with their resources that may need in the future. Well, if this is very tricky, then the EU as a whole is very tricky, because it should be precisely about pulling resources together to face common threats in a way that is much more efficient. It's certainly difficult to understand, both from the point of view of efficiency and also from a humanitarian point of view, that so many ventilators were lying idle in Germany and other places while people were dying in Italy because they had to be deintubated to give place to younger people. And what a better way to build European spirit than for people in Italy to know that your family member is alive because ventilators arrived last night from Germany. And many other questions that should be discussed, but we seem to be entirely focused on the question of Eurobonds. When it was a question of which country is going to be able to assimilate the risks of living with fewer physical restrictions, it turned out to be Sweden, which one almost associated with the life without risk, of a boring Swedish life. And it was the countries that always prided themselves on the cowboy temperament that, in fact, the United States has been applying very restrictive measures almost across the whole nation. But I think, you know, at this point, I don't think the question of risk is really a productive one. At this point, one has to deal in a rational and as scientific as possible, in a way as scientific as possible with the threat. And I don't think anything would be gained by taking risks that so far don't seem to bring any kind of advantage or profit. I think later on, for example, as we talk about whether one should change our approach to technology, that's where the question of risk, I think, will be productive and will be a healthy discussion. But now one would open up cities because we can live with risk would seem to me just to be a way to make decisions not based on any kind of rational calculation. Seems very obvious to me that if a country decides to completely open up, the economic benefits are going to be limited, both because the impact coming from abroad is going to be heavy, but also because even if you tell people they can go out and consume and have fun, they won't. I mean, Donald Trump and some governors may want to open up their states, but people are not going to react by going out to shopping malls the next day. It's not how human nature works. So in the end, we are a bit, we don't have a lot of options dealing with the immediate problem. A bit later, there will be a question. What Sweden is doing, I think, is different. It's not exactly embracing risk in a unreflective way. What I think they're doing is try to establish a level of restrictions that is sustainable over time. And that seems to me smart, actually, so that you don't have to zigzag and you don't have to go up and down with those measures, as I think other countries like Italy, Spain, and Portugal will have to. And I think after a year, perhaps we'll come to the conclusion that Sweden was actually been able to deliver a better result because they have a sustainable framework in place and the changes they will introduce will be very granular. The way you're going to remove some of the restrictions is essentially performing social experiments with human lives, because what you do is you remove one particular restriction, let us say church services, and then you look at the numbers and you see if there's an impact in number of cases and therefore by necessity number of deaths. And if you conclude that it had an impact 7 days later, then you reestablish that restriction. So basically you're using deaths as the variable to adapt your public policy decisions. It's going to be very, very problematic, I think. And Sweden finds itself in a position where it already has a sustainable framework. Young students until age of 16 are going to school. The ones in university can do it at home. Some shops are open, parks are open, people can circulate on the street. Nursing homes are closed to external visitors. So there seems to be a framework in place that potentially could be kept over many months. Whereas what we have in the UK, in France, in Portugal, cannot be kept for much longer. That's obvious. That's how I would see the question of risk, and I'd be more interested in discussing it a bit later. I wouldn't have particular admiration for a politician that said, let's open up, and because a free society is based on risk. A free society is based on a certain idea of risk as adventure, as exploration, as innovation, not an idea of risk where you jump out of the window to see what happens. I'm not sure that's even the dictionary definition of risk. It seems recklessness, which is a different concept. Well, this is different from 2011 because in 2011, the crisis was very much contained to the south and to Ireland. Germany did very well because in any case, its major export markets were not in Southern Europe, even though Southern Europeans kept saying they were, they weren't. They were in the UK, they were in the US, they were in China. There was a flight to safety, so interest rates actually came down in Germany. And Germany never felt that it was in the middle of the crisis, but now it is, both from a public health point of view, and we don't know how the epidemic will evolve in Germany. Certainly, they've been less restrictive in their public measures, not Sweden, but less restrictive. They may, in the immediate term, pay a cost for that. We don't know. It's just too early, and there will be other waves. So it would be really reckless on Germany's part to conclude that its public health situation cannot be affected. And then the economic situation can certainly be dramatically affected, because this time around it's a global crisis. All global markets are collapsing, and we're going to see the numbers. This time around, it's not going to be the case that Italy is going to be in recession and Germany will be growing. Germany will have a very deep recession, which I don't think is going to be that different from the recession we're going to have in Spain or Portugal. I think Italy will be deeper. So if we end up with a 30% GDP fall in Italy, 9% in Portugal, 7% in Germany, we're all in this together. So I don't quite understand that there's still this kind of remnant from the past that German decision makers are concluding that they are of this in some way. I saw yesterday Merz, one of the candidates for the CDU leadership, made some extraordinary statements that literally this is quite impossible to believe. He tweeted that since Italy is not asking for an ESM program, it means that it doesn't really need the money, and it's just using the coronavirus crisis as a pretext to bring in institutional changes like Eurobonds and others. This is sort of a statement that is designed to alienate people in Italy. So, back in 2011, we had accusations of profligacy and laziness, and now we have accusations that are even more serious of some kind of dishonesty. Hoekstra, the Dutch finance minister, also made some statements that Spain should be investigated. Where is the money? Why don't they have the money to address this? They should have it. This sort of statement. So I see what you're saying, that Germany is almost constantly under pressure, but they seem quite able to resist that pressure. Germany is able to veto or block any development in the EU, so it is in a comfortable position. The problem is that this time around it will be deeply affected, and Germany needs this time around a EU-wide response to the crisis, much more than it needed last time, and I just don't see that happening so far. Angela Merkel has now entered this realm where anything and everything she says and does, she's praised and celebrated by the international media. She can do nothing wrong. That kind of removes all the pressure that she had back in 2011. She's become almost a Gandhian figure. I don't think that's very good for a politician that is still in service. And so I don't see the next leadership probably now is going to be postponed, the replacement. And so I just don't see, and tell me where you disagree, but I just don't see the awareness in Germany of how serious this is this time around for Europe, which is very much connected to Germany's national interest, but also for Germany itself, by the way. Germany was a country that, by the way, was already in recession or hovering right above recession even before the coronavirus crisis hit. It was already under enormous pressure from China, from Trump, from Brexit. So I think the situation this time around is quite delicate for Germany, and the fact that the hospitals reacted well shouldn't be a cause of undue complacency. And from what I read, it's also the case that it just happened by luck and chance that the people that in Germany were infected at first were generally young people that had been skiing or in school excursions, as opposed to other countries, Italy in particular, where it was older people that were affected at first. there were countries in Europe that reacted faster and better. I was talking about a certain average of the European reaction, but clearly, I think Czech Republic or Czechia, Slovakia, Poland, you know, there could be a debate here about whether these countries, what I talked about in terms of being sociologically and psychologically more aware that the world is not always a hospitable, comfortable place, that trouble can be just around the corner. I mean, we all know that this awareness is more vivid in Central Europe as a result also of recent history than it is in Western Europe. It'll be interesting to reflect on that. It's particularly, I think, positive, and we all appreciate it, that in fact these countries that did so well don't spend their days telling the rest of us that they did well and we did so badly. You know, we've been receiving those kind of messages from China with no justification in China's case, and I think it's very appreciated that we don't actually see this kind of gloating coming from countries in Europe that did much better than others. And perhaps we could expect that kind of gloating if it was the other way around, that always ready to, countries like Germany and France are always ready to lecture Central Europe when things don't go well. Very quickly, I'm myself not a fan of Eurobonds for some of the reasons the ambassador mentioned. I think there would be other instruments that we could develop here, either the ESM or a dedicated fund for reconstruction that is being talked about for economic reconstruction. And then I think the change that we'd have to introduce is go back to the question of conditionality and realize that it doesn't apply the same way now that it did in 2011. Because now it's about responding to an immediate crisis. It's not about responding to budget or debt dynamics. So I would be entirely comfortable if this new dedicated fund would be able to grant loans, and even in some cases grants, without any conditionality attached. Is it really a question whether Italy and Spain are going to waste the money that they receive from the ESM when we see what is happening in those two countries in particular? What kind of conditionality is appropriate here, apart from the conditionality of addressing the crisis, saving lives, saving jobs? I think it's a very different debate from 2011. And the frustrating thing is that there are people in the South that are having the same debate, but there are also people in the North that are having the same debate when the circumstances are so different. So far, the coronavirus crisis has not have a very significant impact on dynamics that were happening before. It is true that transatlantic relations were under strain. They have been under strain for a long time, even before Trump. I think was already obvious with Obama as well that the United States were not engaging in the way that they used to. That was obvious, by the way, during the Brexit discussion, where even though Obama gave a token appreciation for Remain, he didn't get deeply involved in the question in a way that a president 30 years ago would have. Has the coronavirus crisis changed this? Well, it has created a greater psychological distance because the media environment is so different. Because the political environment is so different. I think many Europeans look to what is happening in America with incomprehension. This is a topic of my most recent book, and I think it's been deepening, that it's becoming more and more difficult for Europeans to understand America. They don't understand the response. They don't understand Donald Trump. They don't understand how Donald Trump can have a 50% approval rate, a 49% approval rate at the moment. And it's very obvious that Europe, for the first time, is dealing with a major crisis essentially alone. And that is a big historical change, which will make things more difficult. I noticed, for example, that Ursula von der Leyen made the comment that Europe needed another Marshall Plan, which is a kind of an interesting Freudian slip, because you go back to the moment where Europe and the United States are brought together, and the United States helps Europe's reconstruction. But she should have added that Europe needs to now launch its own Marshall Plan for Europe, but also perhaps also for the neighborhood. But that's not what she said in the end. So there's if anything, I think the importance of the moment for transatlantic relations is what I've just said, that for the first time, a major crisis is not, for the first time since 1945 or even before, is not addressed by a unified front of the United States and Europe. I see nothing, no evidence of that happening. A couple of nights ago, one of the press briefings by Trump, there was an interesting moment. The Dr. Birx that works with him on this put up a slide on screen with the number of deaths per unit of population. And then the three countries in that graph that are doing better were Iran, Germany, and China by this order. And then Trump interrupted her. It's a wonderful photo, immediately iconic, where he's pointing to the Chinese numbers and saying, does anyone believe this? And then he moved his finger, pointed to the Iranian numbers and said, does anyone believe this? But you saw the sort of unconscious transatlantic bond there in the fact that his finger moved from China to Iran, and he didn't cross his mind, even for Trump, to say, do you believe the German numbers? Because he does believe them, and because in the end, when he's not playing some kind of act for his audience, he does think that he can and has to work with Germany, and he can't and does not have to work with China and Iran. So the question, I guess, that you're asking is this sort of unconscious substratum of identity and partnership, or will it come to the surface, or is it just limited to these small moments like the one in the press conference? So far, we see very little evidence of it. Now, there will be a question, of course, if some countries in Europe are in need of an economic reconstruction plan, who will step forward? And we've discussed how difficult it will be for the EU to do that, or at least to do it alone. And at that moment, there will be a question of whether China does it or the EU and the US do it together. Imagine for Italy, something like this might be necessary. And there will be a critical moment where many things will be responded about the future world order. We'll have to wait for that. It also depends, of course, I think, I don't think this is all about Trump, but it does influence things, whether it is Trump or Joe Biden, the president, after November. The gossip and that I'm getting from Brussels is that the Green Deal is in trouble. So potentially you could have two kinds of responses. Let's push harder. This crisis actually shows the unsustainability of the current model, and it's an opportunity to invest and to give a boost to the economy. Or you could have the case that this would have been practicable a year ago, but with the deep crisis that provoked by the coronavirus, it's no longer possible. Now, this is a very important question that is not answered theoretically, or not even answered with arguments and public debates. There's a lot of political action. There's a lot of influence and lobbying from different companies. And all I can tell you is that the gossip I hear is more towards the idea that the Green Deal is in bit in trouble, and there's a lot of pressure being put on it, and perhaps some of the projects could be postponed. Now, it doesn't mean that this game is over, and people who care strongly about this, they just have to join the fray and push in the other direction. I don't have very strong opinion on this question, to be honest. In China, which I know better, it was very obvious that the authorities directly connect economic growth numbers with environmental policy, to the point where if the numbers are going down, they will relax the restrictions on pollution, for example. As the economy started to show some strains in 2018-19, pollution levels went up, because this is seen by Chinese authorities as one of the levers they have, and one of the form of economic stimuli is actually to relax environmental policies. So now that I can't quite remember the number, a contraction of 6% they announced a couple of days ago. I would imagine that the reaction in China will very, very obviously be to put some of these things on hold. I kind of struggle to see a country that will conclude that this is the moment to push harder for that. I'll see a lot of activists and intellectuals and commentators saying that, but let's see if any country takes that view, apart from countries you mentioned before, who perhaps may or may not, even in their case, Sweden and others. The obvious answer here is that in principle, it should mean that Donald Trump would lose the election. I mean, there's some videos from the Biden campaign. They are absolutely deadly. Quotes, Trump was very imprudent. He's not an imprudent politician. That's the first time I started to notice he could win in 2015. I started to see some interviews where he was very careful with what he said, knowing very well that it can get you in trouble later. That's when I realized he was serious in 2015. But on this, for whatever reason, he was very imprudent. He's on record saying things that look very bad in retrospect, all throughout February. Economic collapse is at least as deep as 1929, 30, probably deeper. Unemployment numbers are going to, I think, are going to reach those levels of close to 30%. How can a president win in these circumstances is the question. Now, I think Biden is a relatively weak candidate and vulnerable on many points. And I also wonder, precisely the fact that this is so unprecedented may change the rules of the game a little bit. We shouldn't conclude that because this is the deepest economic depression since 1929, that no president has any chance, precisely because no one has experienced this before. People may be less inclined to directly blame the president as they would for a normal recession. Some of them may conclude that this is China's fault, and others may conclude that it is an act of nature for which the president is not directly responsible. Americans tend to be very unforgiving about this sort of events, and they would obviously remember how the first Bush president lost the re-election because of a rather small and short-lived recession. But you know, Trump, in a way, was preparing all his life for a moment like this, where the rules of the game have to be changed, where he has to dramatize the situation beyond anything imaginable, where the basic fact that he didn't prepare adequately for the pandemic is going to be buried under so many different narratives and so much drama that already people seem to have difficulty remember some basic facts. Now imagine 3 months from now, no one will remember, you know, there's already so many movie scripts on top of each other and interacting. And so Trump is good at this. I think if any president could survive something like this, it's actually Trump. Because by November, it may be that the circumstances are very different. It may also be the case. I don't entirely exclude it. I think I exclude it in Europe, but I don't entirely exclude it in the US, that by October, the economy is showing some signs of life and recovery. It will be necessary, I think, obviously. I think it will be necessary even after the vaccine, simply because, well, the vaccine will take a long time to be administered to, is it 8 billion people, or at least a large majority of it, so that the globe as a whole acquires immunity. And then I think it's not an expert on this, obviously, but I think it's more or less inevitable that the vaccine we get, especially at the beginning, is not going to be 100% effective. So essentially, it will significantly reduce the chances that it will get affected, but not entirely eliminated. And for many people, that won't actually change the basic facts. If people tell you, you now only have 20% chances of being infected as opposed to 100% before, for many people, this will not be so different after reading all these horror stories that we read every day. So I think it'll take a long time. The trauma, the shock, very significant. And now different countries will start to look at the ways to address this. In some cases, it will be technology, a whole technological system, a whole digital surveillance system, which could be effective, but will be also very scary for many people, similar to the one that the US developed for counterterrorism, which I think has been effective, but has raised enormous polemic and controversy. In other cases, it might have to do with urbanism. It may have to do also with changing our healthcare policies, having more redundancies, more stockpiles. All this is going to be very expensive, changing our hospitals, preparing our health system for pandemics. You know, obviously, we were completely unprepared. This is in every strategy document. But then when it happened, people with COVID were taken to normal hospitals rather than dedicated hospitals in many countries. All these protocols will have to change. Our transportation systems, you know, all this is gonna have enormous impact. I think the people that were arguing for public transportation, for trains, they basically had won that argument, and many societies in the West were moving in that direction, less reliant on the car. Now we're kind of having second thoughts because, and this has helped many parts of the United States. It's not a coincidence that it's New York that's suffering so much. It's because of the underground system, subway system, which by the way is very vulnerable to this. Other subway systems are better. How are we going to do this? I mean, ideally, we would be able to change the shape of our cities, and it would be quite possible to do it in a way that actually would become quite resilient to a pandemic. But that is enormously expensive, and in many cases, simply impossible. How would you change the tube system in London or the underground system in Paris? They're very vulnerable, but they're there. They've been there for more than 100 years, and we can't quite change them now. But in other ways, it might be possible to change some of the ways our cities are prepared and designed, make them more resilient. I think some societies are going to go this way, changing infrastructure and changing habits. China clearly is going to have a very aggressive policy of education and instruction in hygiene habits, very aggressive policy. based on social control and so on. Europe probably is going to be interested in redesigning our cities a little bit. The US probably more interested in technological and digital technology solutions. I think we're going to see different kinds of solutions in different countries. But it's going to be very interesting. And by the way, it's going to be an area where many jobs are going to be created in different ways, either in digital technology or in smart cities development. Perhaps an area that obviously should be part of the economic recovery plan. And, you know, since we're going to do that, make our societies more resilient, let's think not only about pandemics, but also about make them more resilient to climate change, where it can be done, in some cases it can be done, make them more resilient to cyber attacks. Think about all the existential threats, now that we know that they can happen. Go through the whole list and see how we can use the economic recovery plan to make ourselves more resilient. In the book, I argue that neoconservatism has an almost childish nature to it. It is based on this relation to the world where you are seen in the role of the hero that goes out into the world, performs a heroic feat, and returns home covered in glory. It's a disposition that does not awaken any kind of curiosity about the world. Everything is about you. It's egocentric. It's egocentric at the level of societies, but it's egocentric at the level of personalities as well. As you read those stories about the Iraq War and the aftermath of the Iraq War, is really almost a adolescent disposition that is present there. And I think one thing that I care deeply about in all my books is curiosity about the world, and in particular because I think there's no curiosity about the world if it doesn't go together with an awareness that the world is a strange place that takes a long time to understand, and that different parts of the world are very different from each other, that you would need many lifetimes to understand these subtle differences, and in a way there's no better way to spend your life than to explore these differences, because they have to do with different possibilities for human life. You only have one life, but you could have, if you had been born in India or in Russia, your life had been different. And I think there's a kind of a duty on all human beings to expand their own lives in a way that includes other lives, at least an awareness of them and some knowledge of them. And I just think that neoconservatism is the negation of this. So it's a very poisonous idea, not just in practical terms, in the way it shapes your foreign policy, but almost in cultural, civilizational terms, in the way that it closes your mind to the rest of the world. I think that's sort of already enough as a criticism.